Yes. Daphne Colton said it quietly, the way a person says something they've rehearsed alone so many times that the word has worn smooth, all its edges gone. Her hands were flat on the table. She was making sure they stayed that way. Across from her sat Sawyer Harlow, watching her with the patience of a man who had already waited through the hardest part and was willing to wait through whatever came next. Her father George couldn't look at her. Her mother Ellen had her hands pressed over her mouth. The paper between them was one page. It didn't need to be longer than that. She was 24 years old. She had never spoken to this man before today, and in less than 3 weeks she would be his wife. If this story has found you in a quiet moment, you're in the right place. Stay with it all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from. I want to know how far a story can travel. The spring that broke the Colton homestead wasn't dramatic. That was the cruelest part of it. There was no single catastrophe, no flood, no fire, no one terrible week you could point to and say, there, that's where everything changed. Instead, it was 3 years of not quite enough. A dry summer, then a wet one that rotted the grain in the field, then a winter that took 11 of their cattle and left the remaining herd too thin to sell at any kind of price. George Colton had borrowed against the property twice. The second loan had come due in March, and it was now April, and the bank in Pincher Creek had been patient, as long as it was going to be patient. Daphne had known something was wrong the morning her father came in from the barn, without finishing the morning feed. She was making oatmeal at the stove. She heard his boots stop in the doorway and stay there. "There's a man coming this afternoon," he said. "Sawyer Harlow." She knew the name. Everyone in the foothills knew the name. Harlow cattle were on half the hillsides between the Porcupine Hills and the Oldman River. Sawyer Harlow had come up from nothing 15 years ago, bought a failing quarter section, and built something nobody had expected him to build. He kept himself apart. He didn't come to the dances in town, rarely came to Sunday service, hired men who had run out of chances elsewhere and paid them without complaint. People said he was cold. People said a lot of things. "Why would Sawyer Harlow be coming here?" Daphne asked. George set his hat on the table and sat down heavily. He said nothing for a long moment, long enough that she stopped stirring and turned around. "Papa." "He's offered to settle what we owe," her father said. "All of it, the banknote, the feed loan from the Hendersons, all of it." In exchange for what? It wasn't a question, she already knew. George looked at the tabletop. Ellen appeared in the doorway from the back room, arms crossed tight over her chest, eyes already red. "You can't be serious," Daphne said. Her voice was very controlled. She had learned to be controlled a long time ago, growing up in a house where there was always something precarious that needed not to be disturbed. "He's not a bad man," George said. "He's a stranger." "I know." "Papa, I have never once had a conversation with this man. I don't know anything about him except what people say, and what people say is that he's hard and cold and doesn't need anyone." "I know," George said again, and the repetition of it, not an argument, not a justification, just the same exhausted acknowledgement, was worse than any explanation would have been. Daphne stood at the stove and let the oatmeal go cold. She thought about the bank letter on the kitchen shelf, the one she wasn't supposed to have read but had. She thought about what losing the homestead would mean, not abstractly, but concretely. Her younger sister, Frances, 15 and already too smart for any school within 60 miles. Her brother, Patrick, 12, with their father's quiet stubbornness and no place to put it if the land was gone. Her parents starting over at an age when starting over was a different thing than it was at 24. She was the oldest. She had always known that meant something, even when she wasn't sure exactly what. "Tell me what time he's coming," she said. Sawyer Harlow arrived at 3 in the afternoon, which Daphne noticed and filed away. Not too early, not the move of a man trying to catch them at a disadvantage. Not late, 3 o'clock, on time. He was taller than she'd expected. He ducked slightly under the door frame, and when he straightened inside, the first thing he did was remove his hat. Her father had offered the parlor. Sawyer looked at the parlor briefly and suggested the kitchen table instead, which George agreed to with visible relief, and which Daphne took note of as well. The parlor would have felt like a transaction. The kitchen table felt like a conversation. Her parents excused themselves. She hadn't asked them to. "Miss Colton," Sawyer Harlow said. "Mr. Harlow," she said back. He sat down across from her and didn't start immediately. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand before they speak, not sizing her up, not calculating. More like listening, even before she'd said anything. "I imagine this afternoon hasn't been easy," he said. "No. I want to say something before I say anything else," he said. "You can refuse this. I'll clear what your family owes regardless, and I won't make any of this harder for your father than it's already been. But if you refuse, I won't come back. I need you to know that's a real choice, not formality." She looked at him steadily. "Why would you clear the debt if I refused?" "Because your family needs it cleared," he said. "That's separate from whether you marry me or not." She sat with that for a moment. "Then why the arrangement at all?" He was quiet for a beat. "I have a ranch that's running short-handed in the ways that matter most. Not the cattle work. I have good men for that. The household side. The accounts, the coordination with the families on the property, the things that hold an operation together when you're not looking. My wife handled all of it." He paused. "She died 2 winters ago. The operation has been struggling in ways I can't fix by working longer hours." "So this is practical." "Yes," he said. "That's the honest truth of it." "And the rest of it," she said carefully. She watched him understand exactly what she was asking. "That's not part of what I'm offering," he said. "You'd have your own room, your own space. Whatever this becomes, it becomes on your terms and at your pace, or it doesn't become anything at all." Daphne looked at him for a long moment. "You could have made this arrangement with anyone." "I could have," he agreed. "So why my family?" He considered it. "I've watched your father work through 2 bad seasons without asking anyone for help he couldn't repay. That's a particular kind of person. I'd rather build something with a person from that kind of family than with land I already knew was good." He paused. "And I heard you've been keeping the books for the homestead for 3 years. Who told you that?" "Henderson's mentioned it when I settled the feed account." She looked down at her hands. "So you already paid part of the debt." Seemed right to handle the one that was most pressing. He said it without ceremony, like it was obvious, like it was simply the sensible thing to do. She looked at him across the table. "If I come to that ranch and find out any part of what you've told me today is a lie, I'll make sure every family from here to Fort Macleod knows exactly what kind of man you are." Something moved in his face, not surprise, something closer to recognition. "Good," he said. "Hold on to that." She told her parents yes before supper. Her mother held her too long. Her father shook her hand, and she let him, because the alternative would have been both of them falling apart in the kitchen, and neither of them could afford that. That night, alone in the room she'd slept in since she was 5 years old, she allowed herself 1 hour. Fear and grief and anger moving through her like a Chinook, warm and cutting at the same time. She was losing the life she'd imagined. She was 24 years old and signing away her right to choose it differently. That was true, and she would not pretend otherwise. Then she lit the lamp and made a list of what she'd need to bring. She was not going to Harlow Ranch as a woman who had been given away. She was going as a woman who had made a decision with clear eyes, and she intended to stand behind it with everything she had. They married on a Thursday morning in May, in the Colton's front room with the circuit preacher from Pincher Creek and only family present. Daphne wore her mother's cream dress, let out at the waist and taken in at the shoulders. Sawyer wore a clean flannel shirt and his best hat, which he removed the moment he stepped inside. When the preacher asked if she consented of her own free will, she said, "I do," without hesitation. Sawyer's ring was silver, plain it fit. After coffee and her mother's butter tarts, Sawyer brought the wagon around. Daphne carried her own trunk to the door. She kissed Francis on the forehead. She ruffled Patrick's hair until he ducked away from her. She hugged her mother 3 seconds longer than she'd planned. She shook her father's hand. "You'll be all right," George said, gripping her fingers. "I know, Papa." She said it back simply because she believed it, and because she needed him to believe it too. She climbed up to the wagon seat and kept her eyes on the road ahead. Sawyer flicked the reins. The horses moved. The foothills opened up wide and green and indifferent around them, and above the western ridge the Rockies sat white and permanent in the afternoon light. After a mile of silence, he said, "Mrs. Gord's wife came in last week to put clean linens on your room, left some supplies in the larder." "Thank you," she said. Another half-mile. "The hands know you're coming. I told them you're the mistress of the house. Anyone who doesn't treat you accordingly doesn't have a job the next morning." She looked at the side of his face. "You said that plainly?" "Said it plainly," he said, and went back to watching the road. The first morning she woke in her room at the ranch, she lay still and listened. What she heard was work. Not people beginning their day, people already deep into one. Voices in the yard, low and purposeful. Horses moving, the rhythmic ring of a hammer further out. And coffee, already strong, already waiting. She got up. She washed her face, dressed in a cotton dress she could work in, pinned her hair back practically, and walked out to find the kitchen. Sawyer was already gone. A note on the table in careful, economical handwriting. "Coffee on the stove. Hands eat at 6, noon, and 6. List anything you need from town and I'll send someone, SH." She read it twice. Then she poured her coffee, opened the larder, and spent 20 minutes reorganizing it entirely. Then she made breakfast, not just for herself. She counted 7 men in the yard from the window, made enough for 8, and carried the pan to the bunkhouse. The man who opened the door was somewhere in his 60s, built like a fence post, with a beard gone fully gray. "Ma'am," he said. "Breakfast," she said. "Come while it's warm." His name was Gus. He was the foreman. He had worked for Sawyer Harlow for 9 years, and he looked at her with the expression of a man waiting to see what category she fit into before he committed to an opinion. Not unfriendly, just watching. The younger hands were polite in the stiff way of men actively remembering instructions to be polite. One of them, barely 20, thanked her twice and went red about it both times. His name was Ben Taggart, and she filed it alongside everything else she was learning about the shape of this place. She didn't see Sawyer until evening. She'd spent the day learning the house. Larger than she'd expected, and clearly managed by someone who valued function over comfort and hadn't thought much about the difference between a shelter and a home. No curtains on most of the windows. A dining table with a crack in the corner that had never been repaired. Good equipment in the kitchen, stored with no system at all. She noted everything and said nothing. She cleaned what needed cleaning. She didn't touch the office. That was his, not yet. Dinner was on the table at 6. Sawyer came in through the back door at 6 exactly, and stopped in the doorway when he saw the table set properly. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "You have to eat," she said. "So do I. No point cooking twice." He sat. She sat across from him. They ate in a silence that was careful rather than hostile, two people trying not to step wrong. Halfway through, he said, "Gus told me you brought the hands breakfast." "I made enough. Seemed wasteful not to." He looked up. "That's beyond what I asked." "I know." She met his eyes. "I don't do things by halves, Mr. Harlow. If I'm running this household, I'm running it properly." He held her gaze for a moment. "Sawyer," he said, "Mr. Harlow was my father." She looked at him across the table. This contained, careful man who had walked into her life with a bank draft and a plain silver ring, and somehow managed not to be what she'd expected at any point since. "All right," she said. "Sawyer." He went back to his plate. When he rose to take his dish to the sink, he took hers first. She noticed that. The days found a shape. Daphne learned the ranch with the same efficiency she'd applied to everything else, paying close attention, asking precise questions only when necessary, figuring out what she could on her own. She learned about the two families on the outer parcels, wives of hands named Alma Trent and Bet Forsyth, who had been largely cut off from one another since the previous housekeeper had passed. She visited them. Alma's youngest was teething badly, and Daphne's mother had always kept willow bark on hand for exactly that. Bet was lonely in the specific, careful way of a woman who had stopped expecting company. Daphne gave her conversation freely and didn't make it feel like charity. Word came back to Sawyer through Gus that the ranch families were calling the new Mrs. Harlow the best thing to happen to the property in years. Sawyer said nothing about it to her directly. But one afternoon he came in and set a bolt of dark blue wool on the kitchen table without explanation. "What's this for?" Daphne asked. "Curtains," he said, and walked through to wash up. She stood looking at it for a moment. Good quality, better than she'd have bought for herself. She ran her thumb along the weave and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated than that. The next morning she made his coffee exactly as she'd observed he took it, strong enough to mean it. and had it ready when he came in from the early rounds. He paused at the mug. She didn't look up from what she was doing. Neither of them mentioned it. The night that changed everything came in late September, when the first cold front of the season rolled in off the mountains without the courtesy of much warning. Daphne had been at Bet's, helping cut a winter quilt, and she nearly didn't make it back to the main house before the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. She came in half frozen and went directly to change, assuming Sawyer and the hands were managing the stock. But when she came back through to put the kettle on, the house was empty, and the barn light was still burning. She found Gus in the yard. "Where is he?" Gus nodded toward the barn. "Colt's bad. He's been in there since 2 o'clock. "How bad?" Gus's expression answered before he did. She took the lantern from the nail by the door and crossed the yard. The colt's name, she would learn later, was Flint. He was the first foal born on Harlow Ranch the year Sawyer bought the place, which meant he had been on this property longer than any living creature except Sawyer himself. He was down in the stall, breathing wrong, and Sawyer was on his knees in the straw beside him with one hand on the animal's neck, talking to him in a voice too low for Daphne to make out the words. She didn't announce herself. She came in quietly, set the lantern where it would do the most good, and sat down on the other side of the colt. She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. 2 hours passed, then a third. Sawyer never moved away, never let impatience into his voice. He was entirely present with that animal, not performing, not waiting for something better to do, simply refusing to let it face whatever was coming alone. Flint didn't make it. When it was over, Sawyer sat back on his heels and put his hands on his knees and looked at the ground. The silence in the barn was complete in the way a barn goes silent in the cold. Every sound absorbed by hay and still air and the weight of a hard thing. Daphne stayed where she was. After a long while, she said, "I'm sorry." He exhaled. "He was here before the fences were up," he said quietly. "Before the bunkhouse. He was the first thing that was actually mine." She didn't say anything. "I should have had him in earlier." "You couldn't have known it would drop that fast." He was quiet, and then he said something she hadn't expected, said it simply, with no guard on it at all. "I hate losing things." She looked at him across the still form of that horse, at the expression on his face that had none of the careful containment she'd grown accustomed to seeing there, and she thought, that's who this man is. Not the feared rancher of the foothills, not the man who inspired the particular kind of distance that comes from seeming not to need anything. Just a man who stayed with things until he couldn't anymore, and who found that fact genuinely painful. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." He got to his feet slowly, looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite gratitude, but something layered beneath something that looked like surprise, like he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone present in the hard moments. "Daphne," he said. "Come inside, Sawyer." She stood and walked toward the barn door. He followed. She made tea. He sat at the kitchen table. The lamp burned low between them. The wind worked at the windows. Neither of them said much of anything, but they sat there together for a long while, and Daphne understood that something had passed between them in that barn that had nothing to do with a debt, or a contract, or a ring that had still felt like someone else's on her finger a week ago. She didn't have a name for it yet. She didn't push it away. The threat arrived, as threats often do, through someone else's mouth. It was Alma Trent who brought it. She'd heard from her husband, who'd been in town on a Wednesday when Raymond Foss's men were talking at the hotel bar in the particular way men talk when they want to be overheard. Alma arrived at the main house with tight lines around her mouth. She told Daphne what she'd heard without preamble. Raymond Foss had been asking questions about the Harlow property deed, specifically about the original land grant survey, specifically about the western boundary. Daphne had heard the name. Foss was a land speculator out of Calgary who had been buying up parcels through the foothills for 2 years. He was efficient and methodical and had a reputation for finding angles other men didn't see. After Alma left, Daphne went to the office. She had been careful about the office. She'd reorganized the filing system over the course of a month, quietly, without fanfare, and in doing so she had read enough to understand the shape of the property's history. She pulled the land records now, The original Dominion Land Survey from 1884, the amended filing from 1891. She sat at Sawyer's desk and began to read. When Sawyer came in that evening and found her surrounded by documents, he stopped in the doorway. "Raymond Foss has been making inquiries about your survey records," she said before he could ask. The stillness that came over his face was different from his usual quiet. "I know who he is," he said. "Tell me." He came the rest of the way into the room, sat across from her, and told her. Fossey wanted the ranch's western water access, a creek that fed into a series of smaller streams crossing 3 of his parcels to the south. Without it, his holdings in that area were worth considerably less. He'd tried to buy the water access twice. Sawyer had refused both times. "So now he's looking for another way," Daphne said. "That's Foss," Sawyer said. "He doesn't accept no, he works around it." She looked at the documents in front of her. "What am I looking for?" He leaned forward. "Survey markers. If there's any inconsistency in the boundary description between the original filing and the amendment, he could use it to file a competing claim on the western strip." "Is there an inconsistency?" Sawyer met her eyes. "I don't know," he said. "I've never had reason to look that hard." She looked back at the papers. "Then we look." He stayed. She moved her lamp closer. And there in the ranch office, with the prairie wind coming down off the mountains and the full weight of what was coming, still taking shape on the horizon, they bent over the same documents and started reading together. Not husband and wife, not exactly, not strangers either. Something that had been built slowly and quietly out of shared mornings and a dying Colton ledgers balanced in lamplight, and a bolt of dark blue wool left on a kitchen table without explanation. Something that, if neither of them quite had the language for it yet, was nonetheless already real. They found it before midnight. In the original 1884 survey, the western boundary ran from a stake at Maple Creek's North Fork. In the 1891 amendment, the same boundary referenced the South Fork, 2 words, 7 years apart, and between those 2 forks, depending on which document held legal weight, there was a strip of land approximately 50 meters wide running the full length of the western boundary. Land that contained the creek access Foss wanted. Daphne set her finger on the discrepancy and looked up. Sawyer read it once, then again. Something moved through his face, not quite surprise, recognition, the exact shape of what he'd been afraid of. "Who filed the 1891 amendment?" she asked. He turned to the bottom of the page. "Read the name of the Dominion land agent recorded there." "Norbert Castle," he said quietly. "He retired in 1893. She looked at him. "Fossey has a man currently in the county land office. Do you know his name?" A long pause. "Castle," Sawyer said. "Dennis Castle. He's been there 3 years." He set the paper down. "He's Norbert Castle's nephew." The room felt colder. "This was arranged before Fossey even knew he'd want your land," Daphne said. "Someone in his circle has been building this for years." Sawyer stood up, put his hands on the back of the chair. She watched him turn it over, the scale of it, the patience of it, the kind of deliberate long-game interference that didn't announce itself until you were already in the trap. "He's been waiting for a moment when I'd be distracted," Sawyer said. She thought. "He thought a new wife would divide your attention. He thought I was a liability." She didn't say it. She picked up the amendment and said, "We need a solicitor first thing tomorrow." "It's late." "Not tonight, tomorrow." She began organizing the documents into a careful sequence. "And we need copies of both these filings made before anything else happens to them." Sawyer watched her hands moving over the papers. "Daphne." "What?" "You said we." She looked up, met his eyes. "Yes," she said, without hesitation and without explanation. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted just long enough to mean something. Then he reached across the desk and took half the documents to organize alongside her. The solicitor's name was Frank Selby, and he worked out of a narrow office above the general store in town. He was past 60, had practiced in the territory for 30 years, and had the quality of a man who had heard every kind of trouble and declined to be impressed by it. He read both survey documents 3 times, set them down, picked them up, set them down again. "Well," he said. It took 2 more visits, one letter to the Dominion Lands Office in Ottawa and a methodical search of the Castle family's professional record to establish what Daphne had already suspected the night she'd seen the amendment. The change in boundary description was not a clerical error. The handwriting on the 1891 amendment did not match Norbert Castle's other filings from that period. Someone had altered it carefully and then waited. They found the letter at the bottom of a crate of old records in the ranch office, a crate Daphne had set aside 3 weeks earlier and not yet gotten to. It was a note from the original 1884 surveyor to Sawyer's father, dated the autumn of 1891. It described, in careful professional language, a conversation in which Norbert Castle had asked the surveyor to introduce an inconsistency into the Harlow boundary description on behalf of an unnamed client with significant land interests to the south. The surveyor had refused. He'd written to warn Sawyer's father. Sawyer's father had apparently never told him. Sawyer read the letter standing. She watched his face go through the recognition of it. Not shock, something older than shock. The particular feeling of finding out that a threat you'd inherited had a history you'd never been given access to. He might not have understood what it meant, Daphne said carefully. Or he thought Castle had backed down. Sawyer set the letter on the desk with precise care. Maybe. She picked it up. This is what Selby needs. Selby agreed. He filed the counterclaim the same afternoon. Fosse's response came within the week. He was not withdrawing. He was prepared to take it to a full hearing. His solicitors were from Calgary, well-funded and comfortable with delay. 2 days before the hearing, Fosse's men were in the foothills talking. The story they spread was precise and calculated. Daphne Colton had been sold by her family to settle a debt. The marriage was coercion dressed as necessity. Sawyer Harlow had used a family's desperation as leverage. The cruelest part was how close it ran to the surface of the truth. Close enough that people who didn't know them could believe it. Daphne walked through town with her chin level. She did not explain herself to people who hadn't asked for the truth, because she had learned early that defending yourself to a closed mind wastes the breath you need for something useful. But it cost her. Being misread by people who thought they were seeing clearly, that specific cost was real, and she paid it quietly. She came back from town one afternoon to find Sawyer in the kitchen. He was rarely in before supper. He looked at her face when she came through the door, and whatever she'd thought she was hiding, she hadn't hidden it well enough. Gus was in town this morning, he said. She set her basket on the table. It's fine. It's not fine. He looked at her steadily, and beneath the level tone there was something she hadn't heard from him before, something controlled and careful and genuinely angry on her behalf. What did they say to you? She told him. The woman at the dry goods. The implication delivered in the language of concern. What did you say back? I told her I signed the agreement myself, after a conversation with my husband in which he told me plainly I could refuse. I told her the terms were honest, and the arrangement was entered into with clear eyes. I told her anyone who wanted to characterize it otherwise was welcome to come speak to me directly. She paused. There were 4 other women listening. Something moved through Sawyer's face slowly and completely. I should have, he started. Don't, she said firmly but not unkindly. Don't tell me you should have protected me from it. I handled it. I know you handled it. He crossed the kitchen, stood in front of her, close enough that she would have had to take a deliberate step backward to increase the distance, and she didn't. That doesn't mean you should have been managing it alone. She stood in the kitchen and felt those words settle into her. Being told plainly, without performance, that someone wanted to stand beside her in the hard things. Not because she couldn't manage them herself, but because she shouldn't have to manage them alone. She thought about what she'd understood in the barn the night Flint died, that no one had ever taken care of this man, that he had spent his adult life being the person who held everything together for everyone else, and it had never occurred to anyone to ask if he needed the same. She understood now the mirror of that. She had been the one who managed, who coped, who held herself so completely together that people forgot to check whether she needed holding too. I know, she said quietly. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. The gesture was so careful it was almost not there. 2 weeks, he said, then it's done. The hearing was held on a Thursday in October, and when they arrived, the courtroom had more people in it than Daphne had expected. Alma Trent was there with her husband. Bet Forsyth had come alone but stood straight and dressed carefully. 3 other families from the foothills, families who had received help from Sawyer Harlow in forms they'd never been asked to speak about publicly, had decided this was a place to be. Ben Taggart was at the back of the room in a clean shirt that was slightly too large for him, having come entirely on his own, uninvited. Sawyer saw him and stopped walking. Ben looked at the floor. "Figured you might need someone to say what kind of man you are," he said. "I've got something to add on that subject if it helps." Sawyer was quiet for a moment. "It helps," he said. Selby was brilliant. Daphne had thought him capable. She hadn't understood the degree of it until she watched him build the case. Methodical, precise. Each piece of evidence placed with the care of a man building something that cannot be shaken. The original 1884 survey, the altered amendment, the Castle family connection, and then, with deliberate and particular weight, the surveyor's letter. Fosse's solicitors were good. They argued the amendment as the controlling document, questioned the provenance of the letter, suggested that frontier-era record-keeping was inconsistently maintained across the territory. It was competent. It would have worked against a less prepared case. Then Selby called the character witnesses. Alma spoke about a winter when her husband had been laid up and feed had appeared at their door, quietly, without explanation, until March. One of the other families described a barn raising. 4 men sent without being asked and gone before anyone thought to thank them. Ben Taggart described making a costly supply error in his first month, and being told plainly, without cruelty, that a mistake was not a pattern, and he would have the chance to learn from it. Then Selby called Daphne. She walked to the front of the room and sat down and waited. He asked her about the arrangement. She told the truth, all of it without softening the parts that were hard. The debt, the meeting at the kitchen table, what Sawyer had told her, that she could refuse, that it was a business arrangement and nothing more, that she would have her own room and her own space, that nothing would be asked of her that she hadn't chosen. Fosse's solicitor rose for cross-examination. He was smooth and indirect in the way of men who'd learned that direct attacks on women in courtrooms tend to backfire. "Mrs. Harlow," he said pleasantly, "wouldn't you say the financial pressure on your family constituted significant coercion, regardless of what was said at the table?" "The financial pressure on my family was real," she said. "That pressure did not come from Sawyer Harlow. It came from 2 bad seasons and a bank loan. I entered this arrangement because I assessed it honestly and determined it was the right decision. I have found nothing since then to suggest I was wrong." She held the solicitor's gaze. "I have found considerable evidence that I was right." He tried 2 other approaches. She answered both with the same quality, not aggressive, not defensive, simply accurate. He sat down. When she returned to her seat, Sawyer's hand found hers under the table and stayed there. The judge ruled in 40 minutes. The 1891 amendment was found to be irregularly filed, based on the documented pattern of inconsistency corroborated by the surveyor's correspondence. The original 1884 boundary description was reinstated as the controlling legal document. Fosse's claim was dismissed. Fosse left without speaking to anyone. What happened in the courtroom after was quiet rather than loud. Handshakes. Alma Trent hugging Daphne with the directness of a woman who means a thing completely. Ben Taggart at the back, pressing his lips together and looking at the ceiling for a moment before he collected himself. Selby said quietly to them both, "The pattern of interference will likely be referred to the Dominion Lands Office for formal investigation. You may need to testify again." "We'll be there," Daphne said. Sawyer looked at her. "We'll be there," he agreed. The drive home was different from every drive they'd taken. The weight was gone, not just the legal pressure, but the 2-week accumulation of preparation and uncertainty, and the particular exhaustion of waiting for a decision that mattered enormously. What was left in its absence was lighter, more permanent. They drove in silence for a while, the way they'd learned to be silent together, not empty but full. Then Sawyer said, "The east fence is going to need new posts before freeze-up." "I know," Daphne said. "I put it in the supply order last week." He was quiet, and then he laughed. Not the brief, contained version she'd heard before, but something that came from somewhere deeper and lasted longer. The sound of a man setting down something heavy and only now understanding how long he'd been carrying it. She started laughing too, not at anything specific, at the sheer accumulated relief of it, at the release that comes when two people who have been holding themselves very tightly for very long are finally briefly allowed to stop. They drove the rest of the way home like that. The ranch was different after that, though a stranger wouldn't have seen it. The cattle were the same cattle. The fence lines were the same fence lines, some of them newly repaired. The supply orders went out on schedule, and Gus still arrived at the back door with problems at a frequency that suggested he'd made it a professional practice. But the ranch was not silent anymore. It hadn't been silent for a long time, actually. Not since a young woman had arrived with a trunk she carried herself and proceeded, without being asked, to reorganize the larder and feed 8 men breakfast and refuse at every possible turn to be anything less than exactly who she was. On a morning in early November, the first real snow came down off the mountains and settled across the foothills in the particular unhurried way it had, changing the color of everything overnight. Daphne stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched it. Sawyer came in from the morning rounds, stamped snow from his boots in the doorway. He looked at her at the window and said nothing, and she liked that he said nothing, because it meant he understood she wasn't somewhere else in her head. She was right here, exactly where she was standing. Later, she found him at the desk in the office. She walked in without knocking, which she did now without thinking, and he looked up with the full attention she'd learned to expect from him. Not the performance of attention, the real thing. "Daphne," he said, and then he stopped, because that wasn't where he'd meant to start. She waited. "When I made the arrangement with your father," he said, "I told myself it was practical, that you'd manage the household and I'd clear the debt and it would be a fair exchange for both of us. That's what I told myself." He looked at his hands on the desk. "I didn't account for you." She sat down across from him. "I didn't plan for someone who reorganizes the larder on the first morning and feeds 8 men without being asked and sits in a cold barn for 3 hours because she's decided that's where she ought to be." He looked up at her. "I didn't plan for any of it. I didn't plan for you." She looked at this man, this careful, contained, genuinely decent man who had grown so accustomed to carrying everything alone that the simple fact of company still sometimes caught him off guard, even after months of it. "I know," she said. "That's why I stayed." He lifted his eyes to hers. "Not because of the debt," she said. "Not because of the contract. Not because I had nowhere else to go." She held his gaze without flinching. "Because you are the most honest person I have met in my life. Because you show up for things. Because you don't quit on anything worth not quitting on." She paused. "That's why." Sawyer Harlow said nothing for a long moment. He just looked at her, and the expression on his face was so unguarded and so complete that she had to be the one to look away first. She looked at the window, at the snow coming down slow and even across the foothills, covering the old fence lines and the new ones both, settling across everything without distinction, making the whole long country quiet and white and ready. He reached across the desk and took her hand. She let him. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient and unhurried, the way all the best things in that country arrived. Inside the office of Harlow Ranch, 2 people sat across a desk from each other and held on. Not because they had to. Because they had decided to. And that, it turns out, is the only way anything real has ever been built.